Today, I'm going to talk about enhancing trust and introduce the concept of forensic scientometrics if you haven't heard of it. But I want to take you on a three-part short journey. So the first part is a bit more philosophical. What if what happened to journalism happens to science? The mistrust and distrust of science grows due to international tactics and disconnected stakeholders. Those are words I penned 3 years ago in 2022. Journalism had been sucked into shifting from reporting facts to entertaining audiences. The media had become a horror film, slowly destroyed through the gutting of newsrooms and the evolving financial models. The lure of the internet, the chase of the clicks, the viral story, and the information echo chamber would reinforce worldviews regardless of their truth. If one could write, then one could be considered an expert journalist without credentials. And I'm afraid what happened with journalism, the undermining of a field and the erosion of common ethical standards, is and will happen to science. The world has dramatically changed in only a few decades with vaster and faster ways to communicate. Where 20 years ago we navigated our physical world with paper maps and printed timetables, today we rely on smartphones for both activities. In science, we were bound to the printed journal and physical conferences for discourse. And now we still rely on those printed materials and in-person meetings for the most trusted information. But as in today, there is a welcome virtual component to help us gather. Global science and financial pressures have changed scientists and science from focusing on a local community with a slow communication cycle to globally, and most notably, external to science, discussing and communicating work at a speed uncomfortably fast for most researchers. But the rules of scientific communications have changed, and scientific checks on the reporting of science should as well. In the next few minutes, consider the changes in how science is shared due to the internet and open science. Look at the examples of outside influence into scientific discourse, from confusing conversations to the politicalization of climate change and COVID. Then ask yourself if we can continue to act as siloed pillars within the scientific ecosystem and still maintain the trust in science we think we deserve. Scientific knowledge is a pillar of modern existence. Coalesced over 2,000 years ago in the Library of Alexandria, knowledge was collected, studied, and discussed by scholars. This knowledge transported us into the future as we know it. Earth, wind, water, and fire were no longer elements, but studied entities that would transform agriculture, transportation, and public health. Time and people have a way of harnessing, harvesting, and halting knowledge. Intentional tactics, such as political manipulation of the scientific processes and insertion of bad actors into science, they exist. In 2019, in the name of open science, the US EPA was charged by the White House with modifying the information they used to make policy decisions, such that most policies needed to be backed by open research data. So we saw what was coming in these early months of 2025 back in 2019. But politics has always danced with science. In the Great Library of Alexandria, knowledge may have been collected, studied, and discussed by scholars. Pure it was not, though. The library, or rather the knowledge that it held through the thousands of scrolls, meant power. Originally intended to show Alexander the Great's dominance, the library had passed through many political hands over the centuries that it had existed. But the library represents the battle for knowledge. In contrast to popular belief, scholars say the building did not disappear quickly in a blazing fire, but it eroded from neglect over time. Can this happen again 2,000 years ago? I posited these questions 5 years ago, but early 2025 brings them to reality. It is possible that this could happen again. Together, the internet coupled with open science and stretching ethical norms make it easier for political positions to look like scientific theory and be seen and amplified. Not knowing whom and what to believe eats at foundations of trust. No longer confined to the walls of a library, information now flows through anyone with access to the internet. Opening the content of research through open science further pushes society towards democratizing knowledge. But democracy is a form of government that only works with the understanding and adherence to ethical and social norms, and those are being tried. So let's go on a short journey. Once upon a time, there was an incredible global social network of people and ideas. This was a time before it grew musky and crossed its name. And one researcher was upset someone had copied their paper. So I looked at how this could have happened, and something curious was definitely afoot. I was looking at the trust markers of the paper. And what stood out was that the funding organization did not appear to exist except through unvetted sources on the internet. So I probed even further. Pharmacon Neuroscience Network that I could not find in a trusted, vetted source in less than 4 years had a total of 123 peer-reviewed articles with over 6,000 citations and 361 unique authors. 232 organizations are knowingly or unknowingly involved in this network, and it affects over 40 countries. I have delved into these organizations this year to look at the impact of what the legitimate, I say, vetted organizations of knowledge bring and how we actually vet organizations of knowledge. And I'm going to take you 2 examples in a few slides. But first, I'm going to give you of another way that science, that scholarship has been manipulated through another example of a network. In this example, papers have been published and cited to support a particular ideological agenda. In the special research issue, Fertility, Pregnancy, and Mental Health, a Behavioral and Biomedical Perspective, the guest editors, the peer reviewers, and the author all shared strong political and ideological views on 2 papers out of 6 in the special edition. Their conflicts of interest were apparent after the fact, and the relationships with ideological organizations that should have been declared were not. But the paper was published. And the important thing is, even though it is now retracted, it is still available on the internet. And we could, through these networks, through the communities, look at the knowledge networks in which organizations we would have expected to have been working in this space. And here is what we would have expected for people to have been collaborating on this particular drug. But this is what was used. And now 3 papers have been retracted. But again, that information is still on the internet, and it is still presented as scientific fact, when in fact it is not vetted. So let me take you through some other shenanigans. Back to the organizations or into the organizations. Back to that Pharmacon Neuroscience Network, I wanted to look specifically at some of the organizations that didn't have identifiers to understand, was it an algorithmic error on our part in our community that we couldn't find and we didn't have these organizations properly identified, or was it something else? So first we came across SWILife or SWALife, we're not sure. This is an organization with publications, with a YouTube channel, and a book on basic clinical research. It is a research-based startup that was registered in Ireland. So I contacted my friend Anne Campbell, who's Irish, and said, can you help me figure out? I want to understand, perhaps this is an organization that we just don't know about. And we found that it actually is a registered entity in a business park in Ireland at a place that registers companies to be in existence in Ireland without having to have a physical presence. So what they present on the internet and what we could find are two very different things. Moving to a different country, we have AFNP Med Austria that was also in there. I had the opportunity to be in Vienna and I knew the address, so I went by and I looked for it. In fact, it is a massage therapy or a massage place in Austria, and with no known names or organizations that fit AFNP Med Austria. But the one that I think is going to be more interesting to you is the Novel Global Community Education Foundation, also again in the Pharmacon Neuroscience Network. This organization has an imprint on Facebook. It has an imprint on other sites on the internet, but it purports to be a degree granting institution. It is registered in Australia and in New South Wales in a suburb of Sydney. This is by a person who saw Jesus in his dream in 2002 and 2003 and conveyed him to develop the cohesiveness of a global community. Now, I don't purport to challenge anyone's spiritual or religious beliefs. It just struck me as odd that you would be registered as an educational foundation, not as a religious one, but as an educational foundation, and not have any more information on that within your website. So again, it just sparked a spirit of inquisitiveness, and I wanted to dig a little bit further. So the head of this group, or the center of this group, formed something or research enzyomics. Now, enzyomics, I come from a biomedical background, was interesting. I never heard of enzyomics. So I looked that up, and there's no one besides this group and him who work on this. And the publications appeared to come out of nowhere. That can happen in a new field. But again, these items together say that maybe something is awry. And when I came to this page, it definitely confirmed what I suspected, in that this was a place that people could go to and publish in special issues. But whether was it really research that they were publishing? I would challenge that they are not adhering to the ethical norms that we would expect of institutions, of people, of researchers, and of the publications. Where is this located? We were able to find the address, and here is the Novel Global Community Educational Foundation, which is, like I said, a house in the suburb of Sydney. So that's what's going a bit awry. There's a lot more going awry, but I don't want to take you on too much more of that journey. So now let's look at what we could do to improve science. So let me take you through another journey. So earlier one summer day, my husband and I were in London. I now live in London, but we were near Abbey Road. And as we were walking on a delightful sunny morning, we were approached by a man who asked us for directions. And almost simultaneously, two other men approached us, flashing badges and saying that they were passport control. They were checking passports to see if we had any counterfeit money. Now, this is the morning. We weren't quite awake on this, so it might sound odd now that somebody was looking for counterfeit money, but again, we were visitors to this area. They had warned us also of heroin and cocaine in the area, which we thought was a little odd, being from the States and being in that area of London. Anyway, they were criminals trying to scam us. But why did they get as far as they did? Part of it was that they acted like what we thought an authoritative figure would look like by displaying their badges. Here they are, in case you wanted to know. But what I want to bring this to research is, how do we differentiate between legitimate journals, legitimate institution, legitimate researchers, and the ones that are scam artists? Within science, this is the authority, this badge. Could be the author, it could be the article, the journal, or the publisher. Let's take a look at the last two. On a nefarious level, there are predatory journals. Predatory journals, those journals that take a payment for publication without it going through a legitimate peer review process. They will many times have names that sound very familiar to legitimate journals. They are not legitimate, but it is easy to be fooled into thinking that they are, much like the scam artists on Abbey Road. To some, this is just part of the process, that publishers are maybe an evil corporate empire that take more value than they provide. For others, and this is what we're seeing, especially in the States in 2025, that is going or trying to be applied to institutions. So we need to be thinking about the important components and the trusted components that we use to structure science. Right now, we look at the strong reputation of a journal, the strong reputation of an institution, the strong reputation that a researcher is trying to bring. Those are what we look at. But is it the only thing that we should look at, or is there more in this day of open research, open science? Let me take you from a badge to a handshake and take you through another story. A few years ago, these fine young cousins in this picture, the one with the guitar and the one next to him, in just case you're wondering, decided to go to New York City for a trip. And while in Times Square, they met these characters in the photo. One of them, let's just say Spider-Man there, introduces him with a handshake and asks if they want their photo taken. Now, this signals a level of trust. What happens, though, is after the photo, the young men are told they have to tip, with Minnie Mouse showing a sign saying that was the agreement. Now, the cousins say no, then promptly get chased by Batman, who was not in the picture. So, two things happened in this scam. First, the handshake. A handshake, while varying in many parts of the world, generally signifies a level of trust. It can be a simple greeting, a non-written contractual agreement, or a sportsmanship agreement. In many instances, it tries to convey trust between individuals. Second, the familiarity with the characters. The conflation of attention and trust is deceptive. Attention normalizes things to the point where we are more and many times incorrectly, willing to assume something is acceptable just because it is familiar. How does that relate to science? Well, peer review is the handshake of trust in science, and there's actually many handshakes, but I want to talk about this one. It is supposed to ensure that trained experts have reviewed a manuscript. However, research is complex with a great deal of varying types of expertise needed to truly review a manuscript. And manuscripts must be assessed for not only the validity of scientific question and the methods trying to answer the hypothesis, but the completeness, the transparency of the reported work, the trust markers that you've been discussing today. And are 2 to 3 peer reviewers truly sufficient to vet the entire work and the trust of the scientific research? I would say that we need more approaches, more automated ways to check this trust of this gold standard of a manuscript. My last story on this is in 2018, I had the privilege of attending International Data Week in wonderful, warm Gaborone, Botswana. And as luck would have it, I was swindled. With the beautiful weather, I would eat outside along with the wildlife. However, these monkeys that you just saw in the video, quite clever. Their game is a couple of them would distract you, while a third steals your food. And in this case, it was my croissant. I was very upset by this, by the way. How does this relate to trust in science? Well, trust is about believing that someone would do what they say they will do. There is a contract of trust that implicitly exists among functioning societies. That was my issue in trusting the monkeys. They are not part of our societal contract of trust. But unlike the monkeys, one of the crucial contracts of trust surrounds you and surrounds us. We have built out open science in the age of the internet at the scale of social media, and we have not built out those scaffolds of trust around this area, the scholarship, the search for truth that we love so much. So, what can we do? Let me end by talking about thoughts and hope and action on what we could do to improve science. First, we need to admit that there are security and integrity risks. There are risks to individuals, there are risks to institutions, countries, and I would say knowledge itself. We need to acknowledge and admit that compromised activity compromises individuals and institutions, and we need to take action on this. From the work that I was able to do on the Pharmacon Neuroscience Network and working with my colleague Simon Porter, we were able to develop a flag for collaboration behavior indicating risk that we may see. Hope is about solutions. Science is about democracy. We need to build out science, trust. We also need to check. We've also built out a community of forensic scientometricians to detect methods so that we can understand the trust and the mistrust going on within our scholarly ecosystem. The other thing is we must support and verify. With science, we have a firmer process of vetting, communicating science that has lost its meaning and that has not lost its meaning and purpose completely. But it is a great time to adjust our thinking and practices of where science is and where it is going. How open science benefits, but unfortunately can also harm the overall objective and of the understanding and confusion around science as it's currently employed. What checks do we need and which ones can we speed up? And how much can we afford to work in silos when information travels through the air? To preserve knowledge, we need filters like the air we breathe and the water we drink. Who wants to drink from open water sources that haven't been filtered and haven't been checked? People do to survive, but it's not optimal. We need to check, we need to filter this open science of our trusted knowledge. We need a fair means for curation and verifiability that is open, that acts as a filter of toxins with a transparent recipe for verification. We need to work together to be proactive rather than reactive. And preventative measures are new to most of the world, but they do exist, and we should employ them. Now, I want to also acknowledge that science is and will continue to be weaponized for individual, for ideological gain, for political gain alike. But I don't want to leave you with this. I want to leave you with two themes. One is this beautiful illustration by the brilliant W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an American intellectual man who was unfortunately suppressed due to the amount of melanin that he carried in his body. At the time when he lived within the United States, there was very little hope for the freedom at which they might be able to experience. And nonetheless, he put together information. He had a team that worked with him and illustrated inequities. It illustrated expenditures, income of how in that time the Black families lived within the United States. This was, well, in Atlanta in particular, and this was a means not for himself, but for future generations that change could happen. That is hope. And I want to leave with a quote from Rebecca Solnit, that hope is just means that another world might be possible. Not promise, not guarantee, but hope calls for action, and action is impossible without hope. I know there's a lot of librarians here on the call, and I just want to say that if trust is the currency of science, then libraries are the vault. But knowledge doesn't live in vaults, it lives through the people, it lives through our practices, through our protocols, and through the provenance of what we do. Thank you so much.